Welcome to Interfaithing, a podcast for and about Jewish and Christian interfaith families,
where we explore the question, why families can embrace two faiths under one roof.
I'm Ari, the son of a rabbi,
with a degree from the Jewish Theological Seminary.
I'm Anna, the daughter of a minister with a degree from the Union Theological Seminary. We were co-teachers together at the Interfaith community in New York.
And 1 year of working together led to 15 years of friendship and collaboration.
To find us sitting here today, embarking on a new project.
Whether you are part of an interfaith family,
or you're exploring and interested in how different faiths interact with one another,
this is the space for you.
Subscribe to guarantee you never miss an episode.
And help us spread the Torah and gospel of interfaith wisdom far and wide.
And you'll also gain access to exclusive content like our holiday live stream events.
We hope you enjoy every episode.
Listen at your own pace.
Share with a friend.
And don't forget to subscribe.
This episode, we are unpacking the myth of, so you're Jews for Jesus, right?
This is a blending of the two religions, the kind of third way.
And welcome again, everyone, to our latest edition, our second myth for our podcast, Interfaithing, Why Families Can Embrace Two Faiths Under One Roof. I am Ari Sachs, and here joined by my very good friend and Interfaithing co-teacher, Anna DeWeese. Hi, Anna.
Hello.
So we are back with our second discussion about a particular myth associated with interfaith family living. Again, these myths are ways in which folks often think about interfaith families and sometimes even interfaith families themselves as to why they think it doesn't work or why it can't work. So today is a very juicy topic, as all these episodes are, right? All these episodes have lots of stuff to talk about, but this one in particular, I think, is something that people really think about when they think of what does an interfaith family really mean, which is you're kind of combining these two things into creating this new thing, a third way, or as we like to call it here. So you're Jews for Jesus, right? Like that's who you are, because you're Christians and Jews. And so obviously believe in the same thing. Like you're just doing that thing. You're not holding two faiths at the same time. You're creating something new. Isn't that right?
And even a step beyond not just like mixing or blending and only trying to make the parts that play nice together, like lifting those up, but that there's actively this creation of a new, different thing, as in a new religion that is interfaith. And
right.
Our response and what we're going to try to unpack and the people we're going to hear stories from are to say, no, that's not what we're doing.
No, we're trying to be able to hold things up at the same time. We're trying to be able to understand how these religions can be held together. Now, in a later episode, we're going to be focusing on the children and that we might be confusing them. And I think that there is, to some degree, concern about, well, what is the religion of the kids? Because yes, you may have the adults have one religion that they belong to, but the kids, because they're holding both of them, may feel, okay, maybe I don't belong in the Jewish thing. Maybe I don't belong in the Christian thing. And so I'm now this new thing. And while I think it is important to recognize that this is something that is new, that the idea of being able to hold both together and to hold them authentically together, and by authentic, I mean both in respect to what the religions teach and in your own self, that you want to be able to give honor to the tradition as it is. My sense, and Anna, tell me what you think, is that folks think that, yeah, we can, and we don't have to create something new. I mean, who needs a new pope or new prophet coming from a new Mount Sinai, that sort of thing. Like we got good stories. We should use them.
Like the traditions are rich and robust and are still serve a purpose, right? They still make lots of meaning to lots of people in the world. So no, our experiences and the stories that we have from our guests are just highlighting that nobody is coming at an interfaith family dynamic from this space of, I think that there is something missing or lacking or not good enough in these traditions. Therefore, we need to blaze a trail and try to do something new. That isn't what you're going to hear. And there's also, again, our perspective, biased as it is, there's also nothing to be afraid of in the exploration that these couples and families are on. And yes, we're going to focus today's conversation on this question of the third way, the new thing, are you creating something different? But we'll also get to hear, as you mentioned, Ari, in later conversations and episodes, the kids are all right.
That the kids are all right. Yeah.
And some of the voices that you'll hear from are also people who have lived as quote unquote interfaith kids for a really long time. And so even the notion of creating something new is challenged by the fact that, hey, there are folks who were raised in an interfaith context decades ago.
Right.
And are fully formed adults themselves who also now have their own families, and you're going to get to hear from them.
Yeah. So we're going to get into our stories right away. Anna's going to go first with one of her stories.
And then I'll offer my hot take on her story. Then I will share a story and Anna will offer her hot take.
So, Ari, the first story that I have to share with you on our topic today comes from Benjamin, who, as you remember, is our representative from the interfaith community in New York.
If you've just joined us, we were introduced to Benjamin Siegel of the Interfaith Community of New York during last week's episode, the second part of the myth that Judaism and Christianity do not mix.
And so part of our conversation pretty directly got right to this point, which I appreciated so much. And so that is what I have to share, and then look forward to what your response is going to be.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
With goodwill on both sides, there's a path for everybody. With respect on both sides, there's a path for everybody. I think maybe it is a myth that you can't be active participants in one or both religions without someone making massive compromises. I think that's a myth. I think one can be true to one's traditions, and we're talking about the Abrahamic faiths, with which obviously there's a lot in common. So I think there's a lot of commonality, and to the extent that, both parties recognize and appreciate the importance of religion, of tradition, then there's a path forward. One of the issues we have at Interfaith community is, kind of like any religious community or any political party. If you think about a political party, there are some people on the Democratic side who look more like Republicans, and some of whom look a lot more like, extreme left sort of socialists. In the same way, in any religious community, there can be, even in interfaith, there could be some who are more conservative and some who are less sort of involved, and they're going to some who skew a little bit more Jewish and some who skew a little bit more Christian. But we can come together on the common ground. There's no one path, but our goal as interfaith is to be a welcoming space for everybody. And if you want to add on additional communities, whether it be a church or a synagogue, we welcome that. We try not to be a religion. We're not sort of Unitarians. But we want to sort of honor the traditions. We want people from the opposite religion to feel as comfortable in our events as those from the religion itself. So we want the Jews to feel comfortable at Christmas and Easter, and we want the Christians to feel comfortable at the high holidays and Passover. I think it's realistic to say you can't do both religions intensely. I don't think I could be an intense Catholic, and I don't think my wife could be an intense Jew. And if one of us could, then we'd probably have adopted that religion. But we both recognize that both are part of each one of our religion and traditions is an important part that we want to pass on to our children. We want to have as part of our lives. And as we become empty nesters, we will continue to have as part of our lives. And to think that that's not possible, or that makes us atheists, or that makes us non-religious, is perhaps the closest I can come to a myth.
Well, I wanted to share that story because this notion or the question that comes up around, the kind of third way mythology, that this is somehow like a blending of the two religions that is therefore creating its own separate thing. I just really appreciated kind of how directly and succinctly Benjamin was like, no, absolutely not. That isn't what we're doing. And I kept focusing on the word community, right? And that it was a space and a way for families to be together in honoring each tradition. And yet that each family still, kind of operates in the way that works best for them beyond and outside of the IFC. And so it just really struck me as this clear response.
Right. So I think that the question about, are you now creating this third way, or the point about being a Jew for Jesus specifically, which I think it's important to recognize that there are different real theological questions that emanate from that acerbic question of, so you're not only creating this new way, but you're undermining the tradition that you are espousing as being important to you. And I think that Benjamin's point is, can you be, for lack of a better term, a halakhically minded interfaith family or an evangelistic interfaith family? And by those terms, what I mean is one's very deep engagement with the core aspects of their own particular faith. Can you do that in an interfaith context? And he was raising the point about, could he be a serious Catholic? Could his wife be a serious Jew? If I'm not mistaken, he's Jewish, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So what he's saying there is, do you really think that I could become a serious Catholic just as my wife can become a serious Jew? Like, is that what, like, no, obviously not. So because we can't do that, it's almost as if our own level has to kind of be not as strict. Is that the sense that you're also getting?
I saw it as there is still this kind of like line in the sand that showing respect to your partner's religion, faith, tradition, and background does not mean that you yourself then adopt certain practices and or certain beliefs in a way that creates kind of the third way, like mushy, look at how we're like intertwining these two things as a way of showing respect. It, like, there was a clear line in the sand of, I want to be in the process of being in a community that allows me to experience and engage with something that is the opposite of my tradition, but is not otherwise trying to make myself as an individual or the families as a collective take on some new set of beliefs or traditions.
Your point reminds me of a teaching that I was thinking about bringing in today. There's a text from Philo of Alexandria. Philo was a leader of one of the first major Jewish communities in the diaspora in the first century before the Common Era. a Jewish community that developed in Egypt.
Philo does not explicitly indicate that intermarriage occurred during his time, but he also kind of hints that there might have been intermarriage in his time.
Okay. So in this one piece of his, he has a book called On the Special Laws. This is in chapter 3, number 26. He says this: Moses says, do not enter into the partnership of marriage with a member of a foreign nation, lest someday, conquered by the forces of opposing customs, you surrender and stray unawares from the path that leads to piety and turn aside into a pathless wild. And perhaps you will yourself resist, but your children may be allured by those customs of the fact that you're with a person from a different faith in marriage. Meaning, you may be fine in terms of your own particular belief system, in terms of your connection to your faith, and that what we're really talking about here when it comes to intermarriage is that we're really concerned about the child's welfare. You're going to be fine, but it's the child that's a problem. And I will say that I have met a number of interfaith couples or couples who marry somebody of a different faith background, and regardless of whether their partner converts or not, the Jewish person who marries them has very strong views about their Judaism and even has views about Christianity that you would argue is saying, how is it possible that you're married to somebody who's not Jewish? And so it really is interesting in thinking about how some people are able to really kind of compartmentalize the different pieces of their lives when it comes to faith tradition. And the last thing I'll say about this is that given what Benjamin is talking about here, what he seems to be really interested in is how can we make the space comfortable and welcoming to folks to the different partners and to their families with the different events that we have, so that a Jew can feel comfortable in a Christian space and a Christian can feel comfortable in a Jewish space. Not that we're trying to make a single space that is trying to do both at the exact same time, because that's a very difficult thing to do.
Correct. Yeah. And I even want to distinguish a little bit further, because Benjamin's word was welcoming. He said that a few times throughout the response, and you just offer the word comfortable. And it does seem important to kind of unpack the differences between those two words, or at least from my perspective, to make sure that it's clear that like comfort does not mean assimilation. It does not even mean acceptance. The way that we use those descriptive terms, I think, is itself also really important, right? Like maybe there is a difference between creating a welcoming space versus trying to make everybody comfortable.
So you're saying that being comfortable means you accept my feeling, my way of doing things, and therefore I don't have to be challenged or be made to feel uncomfortable, to be kind of put outside of this zone where I'm kind of aware of everything. Because if I am, then I'm going to need, like if I'm a Christian, I need some Christian signs. I need some Christian actions here, as opposed to if I'm welcomed, then I can be able to kind of perceive it and be able to view what's happening.
Yes. And again, to make the distinction, if only because what I heard Benjamin saying was this like clear line of we're not trying to do the third way thing. And so if you are the Christian partner sitting in a service, an event, a space that is otherwise focused on the Jewish tradition of your partner, you are welcomed and you're comfortable in the sense that you're not necessarily going to be like forced to do something that you don't want, to like actively participate in a way that you're not okay with. But if you do choose to engage in a particular way, you're welcomed to do so. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There's the opportunity to engage.
Yeah.
but it's not something where it has to speak to me. It
Mhm.
speaks to my partner. That's why I'm
Mhm.
there. It speaks to my family because my kids are growing up in it, but it doesn't necessarily have to speak directly to me.
Right. I mean, I do think that there is kind of an undercurrent of one's own faith has to have a certain amount of strength or solidity in order to sit in those spaces, in those events, in those services, and have the experience that you and I were just describing.
Well, that leads me to, as we're going to transition into the first story that I want to share.
Yeah.
So without giving too much of a framework, I'm just going to play the story, which comes from Yvette and Brett.
My name is Yvette Camp, and I come Saffer, actually, and I'm married to Brett Saffer.
So they are members of the Interfaith book group in New York, and Yvette is Catholic.
I grew up Catholic, but actually kind of distanced myself out of the Catholic Church and then reconverted in a later stage in my life. And ever since, I have been more religious and more involved.
And Brett is Jewish.
Brett is Reformed Jewish. He grew up very observant up to a point, and then after college, he kind of grew apart, but he was very culturally involved, and he is now he's more observant a little bit more than before.
And we're going to hear from Yvette about getting married to a Jew and what that's like the first time for her family to hear that.
Oh, okay.
I met Brett by chance, so I really didn't know anything about him. It was not like, oh, we met in high school and go back. No, I just met him randomly. And I didn't grow up in this country, so I grew up in a very Catholic country. So I didn't have any knowledge of Judaism, because in my country, Jews kind of like stay together. They don't mix with anybody else, not because they don't want to, but it's because the religion is so small. They just keep within their places of worship and the synagogues or whatever. At that point, I didn't even know the names. So when I met Brett, it opened a whole different world. And along the way came my family. So, oh, wow. He's Jewish, and what does that mean? So what is the differences between us? Do we need to do something? Are you going, and the first question that all my sisters were, are you going to convert again? Are you gonna convert again? Are we gonna go from like the one, because we had like a little ceremony when I reconvert to Catholicism after a long time? So we're gonna do that for Judaism. Are you gonna be baptized? Is this gonna be something? And I was like, no, I don't need to. We're gonna share. This is going to be we're like, it's like, are you really sure? Because it's like the first phrase, right? Don't mix. It's too different. No, it's not. It is not, actually. I had that conversation with my family, and my family had to explain high holidays. I had to explain Yom Kippur. What is that all about? And then Hanukkah. Why do we have Hanukkah? I haven't got into Sukkot on any other ones because that is like too much for my family. I was like, wait, what? How many holidays do we have? So it was kind of different. And then I had to explain to Brett and some of my family members, oh, I'm very devoted to the Virgin of Guadalupe, so she has a day. And what is that all about? Well, wait, with that, but that's a virgin. You should not be idolatrizing somebody else. Why was that happening? What is that all about? So I had to explain to them, oh, Brett, this is it. It's just a representation. However, she intercedes. Oh, okay. So those silly conversations come along, and the same thing happened with Sammy when Sammy was born. Okay, now what are you gonna do, Mama? I said, of course you're gonna baptize her, right? You're gonna baptize her, right? Of course, right? Because of course, yes, we're going to do it, but we're also going to have like a Jewish baptism, they call them. Maybe naming is Jewish baptism for them. I had to explain it in those terms. It was very funny, but why? It's kind of like a Jewish baptism. oh, double baptism. Perfect, perfect. We'll go, perfect. We'll be there. No worries. Everything will be fine. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We're very happy. So I was kind of like those type of things in our conversation, which makes me laugh now, but at the moment it was kind of a little like stressful. I was not gonna say furious. It was like kind of a little stressful because again, we didn't know. I had to let them know. And they weren't opposed. It's just they had a lot of questions. And that's it. I think it was a good thing.
So I wanted to raise that story first up. I love how at the very beginning of a relationship, it's like how many Jewish holidays are there?
Yeah. It's like, wait,
like,
what?
are we really like that? That's a little too much. There are a couple of major things in that story that I think are really significant for this conversation, because on one hand, we're talking about the fact that you could, as a couple, be welcomed into the faith spaces, and that means synagogue, church, but really even family homes of your machatonim, as they say in good Yiddish, your in-laws. And you can be fully your own faith tradition and not feel like you have to be a member of that experience. You're kind of there as a family. You're there present, and you're there participating in as much as you can. And that's, I think, to what Benjamin was saying here. And that is one way to be able to approach this question, to make sure that it's not that third way. The other way of approaching it, I think, is from what I really got from Yvette's story, which is curiosity. I want to know more.
Yeah.
I want to learn more. And I want to be a part of it. That language of curiosity leads to statements like, oh, this is like a Jewish baptism, which when someone who is steeped in the Jewish tradition and thinking about all of the history around that, the notion of baptism and what that means, also historically in the concept of, for Jews, that it could, rile you up a little bit, like that. No. We're not talking about baptism at all. Like, we're not talking about believing in a particular faith in a certain kind of divinity. And so there's like a hesitancy or a fear even of using language that works for one and to see how that can be translated to another, knowing that it's never going to be a perfect translation, but that there is a desire to want to learn and a desire to be curious, and focusing on that curiosity, or giving someone the benefit of the doubt, as opposed to having the fear that the other wants to convert us, or that they're trying to usurp this tradition that we have.
Yeah. And it stood out to me in a really powerful way, this story. And I appreciated it, especially that Yvette, was recognizing, kind of like in hindsight, looking back on it, I can see the ridiculous elements and refer to them as these silly stories. And I don't think she meant that in a pejorative way at all. But like, obviously at the time, that there was an element of stress, and how appreciative she is that being at the place that she is now in this moment, the effort, the openness, the curiosity that her family showed toward her and her partner allowed something to develop, this respect. And as you said, there wasn't an attempt to replace or usurp or put upon Brett's traditions so that her family would be okay with it, right? Because even the story of, oh, it's like a Jewish baptism, it isn't, because the ceremony itself was not a blending of a Catholic baptism with Jewish words, right? That's not what they did at all. The baby naming was a baby naming. And it reminded me of a story that my father shared during his time in ministry, of essentially meeting people where they are, right? So there was, I'm not going to remember the specific person's name, but there was a pastor who here in the United States was an itinerant minister, right? Like a traveling minister, and that they were engaging with a rural community either Tennessee or Kentucky, but a very rural community who, for various reasons, like in their church, did not have the kind of common communion elements of bread and wine that you would see in most other Christian churches, especially Catholic, Episcopal, Methodist, etc. And that this pastor found himself essentially having to explain to a group of Christians what communion was and why it was important. But that in that community, if he had tried to put upon them the traditional sacraments of using bread and wine, that it was still going to create this distance between them. And so the way that this pastor meets the congregation where they are is to hold communion with RC Cola and moon pies.
There you go. Now that's a communion that I think would be very delicious.
Right? And so this notion that came up for me listening to Yvette talk about, she was not only meeting her partner where he was and expressing this beautiful openness and curiosity to his Jewish background and to those traditions and wanting to learn herself and be curious and understand these things. And then was also able to hold the space for her family to also be curious and ask those questions and put her in the position of having to explain things to them.
Yeah.
And so she, again, maybe she didn't realize this at the time, but she met them where they were in order to help welcome them. Yeah. So in order to like create a space, like we were saying just a moment ago about creating both like elements of comfort in order for them to feel welcomed into an event that was otherwise very unknown to them.
So I think that the other aspect that's important here is what gives you the faith and the trust in the people that you're with, that they're going to give you the benefit of the doubt, that they're not looking to convert you, or they're not looking to change who you are. Because thinking about your origin story for engaging in this work was looking for a sense of Christianity that wasn't steeped in conversion. And thinking about my own story, that my call to interfaith work is not based on wanting to just make Jews more Jewish, but about how these faith traditions can really interact positively with one another. In a certain sense, it has to be holding back an element of what our faith traditions kind of really see as the reason why it won't be, why it would not be able to work. That one's trying to convert and the other's trying to stay firm. And that just doesn't make sense. Like, you got to kind of stay in your own corners. But there's a teaching from the Talmud in Masechet Hulin, which talks about sacrifices that are appropriate or not appropriate to be used. And in this particular section, which is quoted by one of the most important rabbinic thinkers of his generation, Rabbeinu Gershom, that when it came to relationships with non-Jews, there's a difference between those who are outside the land of Israel versus inside the land of Israel. And we're recording this at a time, and though we're not trying to be current necessarily in everything that we do, but we're recording this at the time of a great conflict between Israel and Hamas. And so what's really on my mind is especially how the story of a Jewish state or Jewish nationhood in the land of Israel and its relationship with the non-Jewish communities within the physical land of Israel, but also the Arab nations. It is one where it's a very challenging dynamic, and that there is a fear that one wants the other to be destroyed on both sides in that regard. But the point that actually Rabbi Gershom raises from the Talmud is a statement that says, whatever you might think about the way in which you're supposed to relate to non-Jews in a negative way, or to be very, very wary of what their intentions are, that only exists for those nations inside the land of Israel. However, when it comes to nations outside the land of Israel, you are allowed to engage with them in many different areas, because what they're engaging in terms of their particular religious action is minhag avotam, is the tradition, is the custom of their ancestors who may have come from the land of Israel, but because they're outside the land of Israel, their attachment to the religious fervor of their traditions is not the same.
Huh.
And the point of being outside the land of Israel for all of us who may be listening to this podcast outside the land is that the distance from the conflict, so to speak, inside the land can give us the space to be able to not take our religions, and when I use like perhaps a very controversial word here, so seriously. And that's the point I think that Benjamin was making, right? You can't be as fervent of a believer in a certain way if you want to be able to find a way to make this work. But it goes in both directions, meaning that, yes, I know that I shouldn't be taking my religion necessarily as seriously, but I also am giving the benefit of the doubt to my partner and their family too. And that's the trust that needs to be made, to recognize that we are wanting to continue the tradition of our ancestors. It's not that they're just following the tradition of their ancestors, but that by virtue of living in a different community, in a different context, our traditions change over the course of time. Yeah. And we're willing to engage differently depending upon where we are.
Right, right. And I'm so glad that you're bringing this up. And I heard it as well in both Yvette and Benjamin's stories that we've shared with one another, that imposition is what creates some of the familial conflict, right? That wanting to be, for lack of a better phrase, like left alone to live your life on your own terms and be allowed and respected in being where you are.
Right.
As opposed to, and I think this is where the like fervency or the intensity comes back into the conversation, is that oftentimes like what goes along with that kind of fervency is a sense of, and I therefore must impose my beliefs on other people. At least that's also how it's received. Right. And so I think that's another like important element to this conversation of why it is that interfaith families are not trying to create a third way or do something that is antithetical or taking away from either of the two traditions. It's basically to say, if you want to be fervent, okay, that's your choice. You can have your choice and you can create community yourself along with other fervent believers. But I am still going to set a boundary and say that you don't get to tell me how to live my life.
Right. Very true.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of episode 2. So you're Jews for Jesus.
We hope you learned and laughed with us.
Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss part 2.
We want to thank our supporters and contributors, our families, and all of our featured storytellers.
We also want to give a special shout out to our composer and music producer, Pablo Lengang.
Subscribe, share, leave a review, and send us a message. We would love to hear your feedback and to learn more of your stories.
Find us on any of your podcast platforms to subscribe, and you can also find us on interfaithingpod.com.
Like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram.
And if you really like what you hear, please consider supporting us financially at patreon.com/interfaithing.
So until we meet again, take care.
Stay curious.
And keep interfaithing.